They didn't expect much from a wounded soldier and a forgotten girl at the edge of Aspen Ridge. But when Lieutenant Ryan Hale stumbled through the blizzard and Elena Brooks opened her door to save him, something far greater than survival began. A story of redemption, faith, and love strong enough to thaw the coldest winter. He wasn't just healing from war. She wasn't just mending a stranger. Together, they were rebuilding grace itself. And when spring finally touched the valley, what rose from the ashes proved one thing: God's miracles often begin with a single open door. The wind howled through Aspen Ridge like a living creature, carrying sharp ice crystals that cut across the darkened pine slopes. The night was white and endless, the kind of cold that silences everything except the heart's trembling rhythm. In a small wooden cabin tucked between the foothills, Elena Brooks pressed her hands to the old iron stove, coaxing life from the dying embers. She was 18, with a face both delicate and strong, framed by strands of chestnut hair that caught the faint glow of firelight. Her gray wool dress, patched, frayed, but clean, hung loosely around her slender frame. She was not beautiful in a polished way, but in that quiet, enduring way of those who had known loneliness and still kept faith. Her hazel eyes held something ancient, an old soul's patience, tempered by sorrow. For 2 weeks, Elena had lived alone since her father, Thomas Brooks, a forest ranger known for his discipline and pride, vanished during a patrol up the northern trail. The townsfolk whispered that he had been taken by the storm, but Elena refused to believe it. She still set 2 plates at supper and still looked toward the tree line each morning, as if his tall, bearded figure might appear through the snow. Thomas had been a hard man, broad-shouldered, weathered by years in the wild, his face carved with lines of duty. Yet beneath his sternness lay a tenderness he never voiced, one that lived only in the way he touched her hair before dawn or left wood stacked at her door before heading out. The storm had worsened. Wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, and the roof moaned under its weight. Elena wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket, glancing at the frost creeping over the window panes. She had learned to be brave, but fear was an uninvited guest that always came at night. The oil lamp flickered as if it, too, struggled for breath. Then a sound broke through the howl of wind, a dull, heavy thud against the door. She froze. For a moment, her mind offered foolish hopes. It was her father home at last. She rushed to the door, heart pounding, and pulled the latch. The door resisted, stuck against something heavy. Cold air burst inside like a scream. She pushed harder, the hinges groaning. When the gap widened, the light from the lamp spilled over 2 figures half buried in the snow, a man and a dog. The man's uniform was torn, his arm soaked in dark red that had frozen into his sleeve. His hair, blonde, streaked with ash and snow, clung to a face pale as marble. His jaw was strong, shadowed by several days of stubble. Even in ruin, he had the bearing of someone who once stood tall. A faint breath escaped his cracked lips. Beside him lay a German shepherd, broad-chested, its fur a mix of sable and black, its muzzle flecked with gray. An older service dog. The animal's flank moved shallowly, each breath a struggle. Elena's first instinct was to call for help, but she knew no one could reach them through the storm. Fear pressed on her chest, but another voice, a memory of her father, rose above it. When someone's in need, don't ask who they are. Just help. She dropped to her knees, feeling the sting of snow through her skirt, and touched the man's neck. The pulse was weak, but there. "You're not dying here," she whispered, as if willing the storm to hear her. Grabbing his arm, she pulled with all her might. He was heavy, nearly twice her size, but desperation gives strength. Inch by inch, she dragged him across the threshold, then turned back for the dog. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Don't give up." Shadow's fur was cold, stiff in places where blood had frozen, but when she touched his head, one ear twitched. Inside, she shut the door with her back, gasping, her breath fogging the air. The cabin filled with the smell of iron and frost. She pulled the man near the hearth, wrapped him in blankets, and built the fire anew. The flames took slowly, licking the wood until warmth began to crawl back into the room. She found her father's old first aid kit, its tin box dented but intact, and worked by instinct, cleaning, binding, whispering small prayers between breaths. When she poured warm water over the dog's wounds, Shadow whimpered but didn't move. His eyes, amber and intelligent, flickered open just enough to meet hers. "You're brave," she said softly, brushing the fur behind his ear. "You kept him alive." The man groaned, trying to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Don't," she said gently. "You're safe." She studied his face, the scar above his right eyebrow, the deep crease between his brows hinting at years of discipline, maybe regret. There was something soldierly about him, even in weakness, something that stirred both pity and respect. As the fire grew, the room filled with amber light. Shadows danced across the walls, and Elena sat beside her two strangers, watching their chests rise and fall. Hours passed. The wind softened outside, turning from a scream to a whisper. She could almost imagine that the world had forgiven them for surviving. Exhaustion finally caught her. Wrapped in her father's old coat, she leaned against the wall, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic breath of the wounded soldier. Before sleep took her, she thought of how fragile and strange fate could be, that in the heart of the fiercest storm, it had brought to her door not death, but a man and a creature bound by loyalty. When dawn crept pale over Aspen Ridge, the snow had stopped falling. The cabin stood like a small ember in a sea of white. Inside, the fire still burned, and 3 lives, each scarred, each searching, had found their first fragile thread of connection. The morning light in Aspen Ridge was pale and brittle, filtering through frost-crusted windows like a whisper from another world. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of ash, pine, and faint traces of blood. Lieutenant Ryan Hale stirred on the couch, every nerve in his body reminding him he was still alive. He was 31, tall and broad-shouldered, though his strength had been carved thin by exhaustion. His hair, once sun-gold, was now matted and streaked with soot. A faint stubble covered his jaw, shadowing the sharp planes of his face. There was a hardness in him, a soldier's quiet armor forged by loss. Years in the military had taught him to bury pain behind control, but control was slipping now, melting like snow beneath flame. His gray-blue eyes opened slowly, scanning the unfamiliar room with the instinct of a man who had woken up too many times in strange places. Near the hearth, Elena Brooks knelt by the fire, coaxing the flames higher. Her cardigan hung loose over her narrow frame, her chestnut hair braided back, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, lifted when she heard him move. There was relief there, but also hesitation, the wary caution of someone who has been alone too long. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice calm but threaded with concern. Ryan tried to sit up, pain slicing through his ribs. She was at his side before he could speak. her hands gentle but firm as she pressed him back. You shouldn't move yet. You lost a lot of blood. Her tone carried quiet authority, the kind born of necessity rather than confidence. He studied her face in the firelight, the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the exhaustion she hid behind care. Where am I? He managed, his throat dry, voice roughened by cold and smoke. Aspen Ridge, she said. My father's cabin. You were on the porch when I found you. The words struck him like a faint echo. Her father's cabin. The name carved on the old map he had studied years ago flickered through his fogged mind. Thomas Brooks, a ranger, a name tangled in an old report. He pushed the thought aside. Not now. You saved my life, he murmured. She shook her head. The storm did most of the work. I just brought you in before it finished you. He tried to smile, but it hurt. The movement sent a jolt through his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. Elena noticed and reached for the bandage. I need to change this, she said, her voice quieter now. It's bleeding again. He watched as she peeled back the fabric, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her breath. She smelled faintly of cedar smoke and snow. The warmth of her skin brushed his as she worked, and for the first time in years, Ryan felt something other than pain. Something human, fragile, undeserved. You're not from here, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Your accent. You sound like you've seen the world and got tired of it. He huffed a weak laugh. Maybe I did. She finished tying the fresh cloth and sat back on her heels. Who are you? Lieutenant Ryan Hale, he said after a pause. U.S. Army Special Investigations. I was tracking a convoy, illicit shipments hidden under a timber company's name. His eyes darkened as the memory came flooding back. Harlow Timber Co. They've been smuggling weapons through state routes, disguised as forestry cargo. I followed them too far up Frostline Pass last night. They were waiting. 2 trucks, armed escort. They hit us before I could call it in. My team. They didn't make it. His jaw clenched, grief tightening like a vice. Shadow pulled me out of the wreck before it exploded. We walked for hours. I must have passed out near your door. Elena listened, frozen between fear and sympathy. She had heard of Harlow Timber. Everyone in Aspen Ridge had. They owned half the sawmills, half the town. You think they'll come looking for you? She asked quietly. If they know I'm alive, yes, he replied. But they won't expect me here. Not yet. He met her gaze, steady now. You shouldn't have helped me. It could put you in danger. She shook her head slowly. My father used to say the same thing every time he brought home a hurt animal. Danger doesn't matter when someone's bleeding on your doorstep. Her words carried more strength than her small frame suggested. Ryan studied her, realizing she wasn't just kind. She was resilient, forged by solitude and loss. Your father sounds like a good man, he said. Something flickered in her eyes. He was, she answered softly. He went missing 2 weeks ago in the Northern Trail. Search teams found nothing. They said the storm took him. She paused, her gaze drifting to the frost-blurred window. But I don't believe it. He knew these woods better than anyone. Ryan's pulse quickened. Your father's name? Thomas Brooks? She looked at him, surprised. You knew him. His mind flashed back to a decade-old briefing, a classified file stamped unresolved. Captain Jack Hensley, his mentor, his friend, disappeared during a joint operation investigating illegal shipments through the same forest. The last man to see him alive had been Ranger Thomas Brooks. He didn't answer immediately. The truth tangled on his tongue. I heard the name. he said finally. A good ranger, from what I was told. She smiled faintly, unaware of the storm behind his calm tone. He was strict but fair. He loved this valley more than himself. Shadow stirred beside the couch, letting out a low whine. The old German shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. His fur had dried, the sheen of black and silver catching the glow. He was large and muscular despite the scars along his flank, and his movements carried the deliberate grace of an aging warrior. Ryan reached down to touch his neck. "Hey, boy," he murmured. "Still with me?" The dog thumped his tail once, weary but loyal. Elena smiled for the first time that morning. "He's a fighter." "He's more than that," Ryan said. "He's family." The word lingered in the air like a confession. Elena looked at him, and something gentle flickered in her expression, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Inside, the warmth deepened, stretching between two strangers bound by fate. Elena poured him water and sat across from him by the hearth. The silence between them was not empty now, but alive, filled with things neither dared to name. Ryan leaned back, exhaustion tugging at him, but his gaze never left her. "You saved me," he said quietly, "and maybe I didn't deserve it." She looked up from the fire. "No one earns mercy," she replied. "It's just given." The wind moaned outside, brushing the window like a ghost's hand. Ryan closed his eyes, haunted by the past, uncertain of the future. But for the first time in years, he felt safe. Elena watched him drift towards sleep, her thoughts heavy yet strangely calm. Somewhere inside, a fragile warmth unfurled, fear, compassion, and something new she dared not name. The storm had brought him to her door, but she sensed it wasn't finished with them yet. By the third morning, the sky over Aspen Ridge had shifted from gray to a hard, glacial blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world frozen in silence. The cabin, though small and rough-edged, now felt less like a shelter and more like a fragile alliance built from gratitude and unspoken fear. Lieutenant Ryan Hale stood at the window, his shoulder bandaged, his breath faintly misting against the glass. Though still weak, his soldier's posture remained, straight, alert, as if his body refused to forget its purpose. The days of rest had not softened him. If anything, they had carved his features sharper. Beneath the exhaustion, there was resolve, the kind only men who had lost too much could carry. He could not afford to linger. Answers lay buried deeper than his wounds. Elena Brooks moved quietly behind him, packing a satchel with supplies, matches, rope, her father's old flashlight. Her movements were efficient but subdued, as though each gesture carried weight. Her cheeks were flushed from the firelight, and her hands trembled faintly, not from fear but anticipation. "You're sure you can travel?" she asked. Ryan nodded, pulling his worn gloves tight. "If I don't, we'll never know what really happened out there. To your father, to my captain." She hesitated before replying. "The place you're talking about, Raven Point, it's been sealed for years. They said it burned after the explosion." Ryan's lips tightened. Then someone lied, and lies leave traces. By mid-morning, they set out, Shadow trotting beside them, his gait uneven but determined. The German shepherd was recovering well. His fur shone again, though his right leg still carried a faint limp. His breath puffed like smoke against the cold. The path to Raven Point wound through skeletal birch trees, their silver bark peeling like old paper. Every sound, the crunch of boots, the creak of ice, seemed magnified. For Elena, each step felt heavier, as though the forest itself watched them. They reached the outpost by noon. What had once been a proud ranger station now stood in ruins. Half its roof collapsed. The sign above the door charred but still legible. Raven Point Forestry Division. Ryan ran a gloved hand across the blackened doorframe, the soot flaking beneath his touch. "This place shouldn't exist anymore," he murmured. "They filed it as condemned." Inside, the air was cold and thick with the scent of mold and ash. Broken desks, shattered glass, and the skeletal remains of filing cabinets littered the floor. Elena traced her fingers along a burned wall, her eyes distant. "My father used to bring me here," she said softly. "I remember drawing maps on the old table while he worked. He said the forest was like a person. You had to listen to its pulse." Ryan paused, studying her expression, the ache of memory mixed with disbelief. "He was right," he said quietly. "But someone stopped listening." He swept the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through dust and decay. Then something caught his eye. A faint metal latch half hidden beneath a broken shelf. He knelt, brushing away soot and ice until a square outline appeared on the floor. "A cellar hatch," he said. "Help me with this." Together they pried it open, the hinges groaning like a wounded thing. Cold air rushed out, tinged with rust and old smoke. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Shadow growled low, his instincts bristling. Ryan's hand rested on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy. We go together." The steps creaked beneath their weight. The beam of the flashlight cut across stone walls damp with frost. Below, they found a narrow chamber, intact, untouched by the fire above. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked neatly as though awaiting shipment. Each bore the faded insignia, Harlow Timber Co. Elena's breath hitched. "Oh my God!" Ryan approached one crate, pried it open with his knife. Inside lay sealed metal cases, rifles, ammunition, and beneath them, wrapped in tarred cloth, stacks of documents. He unrolled one carefully. Transport manifests, coded numbers, and maps of forest trails disguised as lumber routes. "They weren't logging," he said grimly. "They were running weapons through state land, using your father's patrol routes to cover their tracks." Elena shook her head, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. He would never be part of this. He loved these woods. He died protecting them. Ryan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "I know. That's why they silenced him." His flashlight swept across the far wall, revealing scorch marks where fire hadn't reached. Embedded in the concrete was something small and metallic, a spent bullet casing. He pried it free, turning it in the light. "This isn't from a wildfire," he muttered. "This was a gunfight." His throat tightened. "Jack Hensley must have been here." Elena looked at him confused. "Jack, your captain?" He nodded. "He was investigating the same routes 10 years ago. The official story said an explosion killed him during an inspection. But if this place burned afterward, someone made sure no one would come looking." They worked in silence, sorting through the surviving papers. Many were half-burned, ink blurred by water damage. One fragment, however, stood out, a page stamped with Thomas Brooks's signature. Next to it, a notation written in different handwriting. "Do not trust Harlow. Meet at Raven Point before dawn." Elena's breath caught. "That's his handwriting," she whispered, touching the edge of the page like it might vanish. Ryan's jaw clenched. He was trying to warn someone, maybe Hensley, maybe anyone who would listen. He folded the page carefully, sliding it into his jacket. Your father didn't vanish by accident, Elena. He was murdered for doing the right thing. For a long moment, she said nothing. Only the soft hum of wind through the cracks above filled the silence. Then tears welled in her eyes. Not fragile tears, but the kind that come when truth is too heavy to bear. He died alone, she murmured, and no one even knew why. Ryan crouched beside her, his expression softer now. Not anymore, he said. We'll finish what he started. His voice was steady, carrying the conviction of a man who had lost comrades, faith, and perhaps part of himself. He took her hand, hesitant at first, then firm, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Shadow rested his head on Elena's knee, as if understanding the gravity of their vow. The air in the cellar felt heavier now, charged with something between grief and purpose. Ryan stood, eyes scanning the crates one last time. We'll take what we can carry. The rest stays hidden until we can prove it. When they emerged from the hatch, the light outside had dimmed to a bruised violet. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and soundless, covering the ruins like a shroud. Elena turned once to look back at the outpost, its charred bones silhouetted against the fading sky. It feels like he's still here, she whispered. Ryan nodded. He is, in what he tried to protect. He adjusted the strap of the satchel filled with documents, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. But we're not the only ones searching. Someone will come looking when they realize this place isn't as dead as they thought. As they started back down the trail, the wind rose again, carrying the faint, hollow echo of the forest, a sound that was neither entirely human nor entirely gone. Night settled over Aspen Ridge like a slow descent of ash. The forest was still, too still, its silence heavy with the kind of calm that precedes violence. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled quietly, its glow painting the walls gold and amber. Lieutenant Ryan Hale sat by the table, his broad frame bent over a spread of damp documents salvaged from Raven Point. His face, once hardened by duty, now carried a different tension, the quiet vigilance of a man who knew storms better than peace. Across from him, Elena Brooks moved softly between the stove and the window, her silhouette haloed by the firelight. She had tied her chestnut hair into a loose braid, strands falling over her pale cheek. The past days had worn her thinner, but her eyes had changed. They no longer carried only fear, but something fierce beneath it, something alive. Shadow, the German shepherd, rested at her feet, his breathing uneven but steady, the soft rasp of age mixing with the faint crackle of the hearth. Ryan looked up from the papers, his voice low. The evidence we found, it's enough to bury Harlow Timber for good, but we need to get it to the state office. Elena frowned, wrapping her shawl tighter. Tomorrow? No, he said, glancing toward the frosted window. Tonight. They'll know by now what we found. He didn't say who they were, but the dread in his tone made her understand. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a scent he knew too well. Smoke, but not from their hearth. He rose abruptly. Elena, get the lamp off. She obeyed without question. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the faint shimmer of coals. Ryan's instincts, honed by years of ambushes, flared alive. He moved to the window, eyes narrowing. Through the snow-thick night, faint glows moved between the trees. Headlights, too low and slow for travelers. They found us. From the woods emerged men, 5, maybe 6, bundled in heavy coats, rifles glinting beneath the moonlight. At their center walked a taller figure, deliberate in his stride. Even through the blur of snow, Ryan recognized the posture, confident, predatory. Grant Harlow, mid-40s, stood like a relic of corruption given flesh. He was tall, broad, his once handsome features hardened by greed. Gray streaked his slicked hair, and a thin scar traced the edge of his jaw, like a reminder of a life spent surviving his own betrayals. He had the cold arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Stay inside," Ryan whispered. Elena grabbed his arm. "Ryan, please. No arguments." He checked the magazine of his pistol, chambered around, and positioned himself by the door. "If they breach, you take Shadow and crawl to the root cellar. Wait there until it's over." The first gunshot shattered the night. The window exploded, scattering glass like diamonds across the floor. Shadow barked, ears flat, his muscles tensing for battle despite the old wound that still stiffened his gait. Ryan fired through the doorway, his shots precise and measured, each report echoing through the woods. The scent of gunpowder mingled with burning pine as bullets ripped through the walls. Elena ducked behind the table, heart hammering, watching him move, fluid, instinctive, every motion protecting her. She had seen soldiers only in old photographs. None had looked like this, so alive in danger, so calm in chaos. "They're setting fire to the back wall," she cried. Ryan turned, the reflection of flame already dancing on the far window. "They're flushing us out." He grabbed the satchel of evidence and shoved it into her hands. "If I don't make it, get this to the station at Black Hollow. Ask for Sergeant Nora Bell." She stared at him, shaking her head. "Don't talk like that." "Elena." "No." The word cut through smoke and panic. "We get out together." The roof groaned as the fire spread. Smoke curled thick through the rafters. Ryan coughed, eyes burning. "Through the back window!" He kicked it open, glass shattering outward into the snow. He climbed through first, then turned to pull her after him. Shadow leapt last, his body hitting the ground with a grunt. Behind them, the cabin crackled, glowing like the heart of a dying star. From the tree line, Harlow's voice carried across the flames, smooth, venomous. "Lieutenant Hale, you should have stayed buried in the snow, boy." Ryan pulled Elena behind the wreck of an old cart. "He likes to talk," he muttered. "Let him." He peeked around the corner, saw the silhouettes advancing. One of them, a young man with a red scarf, moved too far from cover. Ryan fired once. The man fell. The others scattered, shouting curses into the wind. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth. The shock of death, raw, immediate, rippled through her, but she said nothing. There was no room for innocence anymore. Harlow stepped forward through the smoke, his revolver gleaming. "You think you can stop me with a few burnt papers? I own half this valley, soldier. Men like you disappear. Women like her? Easier." Ryan's jaw clenched. "You should have stayed in your office." Harlow laughed, a low, joyless sound. "And you should have learned when to stop digging." He raised his gun. The shot came almost at the same time, but not from Harlow. A deafening crack split the air, and one of Harlow's men dropped, screaming. Blue and red light flared through the trees. Sirens. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then chaos erupted. Shouts, gunfire, the distant bark of orders amplified by megaphones. "State police! Drop your weapons!" Harlow spun, firing blindly before someone tackled him into the snow. Ryan stayed low, covering Elena and Shadow as floodlights cut through the smoke. Minutes blurred into sirens and commands. When the gunfire ceased, the night fell silent again, broken only by the hiss of the burning cabin and the crunch of boots on ice. A female officer approached, tall, lean, her movements sharp with purpose. Sergeant Nora Bell, early 30s, wore her uniform with the easy authority of someone who had fought for it. Her short dark hair framed a face both stern and kind, the kind of strength that didn't shout, but held steady under pressure. "Lieutenant Hale," she called out, "you've caused one hell of a bonfire." Ryan managed a weak smile. "Good timing." "You're lucky," she said, glancing toward the men being cuffed. "We intercepted a radio burst from Harlow's crew an hour ago. You led us straight to them." She turned to Elena. "You must be Miss Brooks. You did well." Elena nodded faintly, eyes glistening from smoke and exhaustion. Behind them, Shadow whimpered softly. Elena knelt, running her hands over his fur. He was trembling, his flank scorched, breathing shallow. "He's hurt," she whispered. Ryan crouched beside her, pressing his hand to the dog's neck. "He'll hold on. He always does." The shepherd blinked, his tail moving once, a weak but determined gesture. As paramedics rushed past, Nora motioned them toward the fire. "Let's get you both checked." Ryan nodded but didn't move. His gaze lingered on the ruins, the place that had sheltered them. Now nothing but embers and memory. Snow began to fall again, soft and pure, blanketing the wreckage in white. Elena leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her automatically, protective, instinctive. Shadow lay between them, the heat of the flames fading as the sirens quieted. For the first time since the storm, Ryan allowed himself to breathe. The evidence was safe. Harlow was caught. But as he looked at Elena, her face streaked with soot, her eyes still bright with courage, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more fragile and dangerous. Hope, the last snows of Aspen Ridge melted like memory, revealing the green veins of earth beneath. Spring arrived shyly at first, a soft wind carrying the scent of pine sap and thawed soil, the whisper of streams freed from their icy prisons. 3 months had passed since the night of fire, and though the valley still bore scars of smoke and ash, life had begun to return, quietly, faithfully. Lieutenant Ryan Hale stood on the porch of the newly rebuilt cabin, watching mist lift from the mountains. His once hard face had softened in places, though the soldier in him still lingered. The square jaw, the steady eyes that missed nothing, and the faint scar along his temple that caught the light when he smiled. He was no longer a man running from the past, but one learning how to live with it. Beside the porch, Elena Brooks knelt among the wildflowers, her hands deep in the soil. Her hair, now longer, fell loosely around her shoulders, its chestnut waves shimmering in the morning sun. She wore a faded blue dress and an old ranger's jacket that had belonged to her father. The fabric was too large for her, but it made her feel protected, as though a part of him still watched from the tree line. Her face had changed, too. The sadness that once haunted her had given way to warmth, a quiet resilience that made her beauty less fragile, more enduring. She hummed softly as she planted a ring of bluebells around the cabin, her breath clouding faintly in the cool spring air. Shadow, the German shepherd, trotted nearby with a slow, noble gait. His fur had grown thick again, darker and glossier, though a pale scar still ran across his flank where the fire had kissed him. Around his neck hung a small silver medallion engraved with the words, "Heroic K9 of Colorado." He was older now, his muzzle gray, his steps more deliberate, but there was pride in his posture, as if he understood the weight of every gaze that followed him. Whenever Elena knelt to plant a flower, he sat beside her, keeping watch with the patience of a guardian who had already seen too much. From the path beyond the ridge, a familiar voice called, "You've turned this place into a garden, Miss Brooks." It was Sergeant Nora Bell, arriving in her state ranger uniform, her dark hair tucked neatly under a forest green cap. The months had not changed her. Still tall, lean, and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman whose confidence came from years of walking into danger and walking out again. Yet today, her usual steel carried warmth. "Thought I'd check in on the new recruits," she said, smiling. "And the hero dog, of course." Elena stood, brushing soil from her hands. "We're managing. The cabin's smaller than before, but it feels more alive." Ryan stepped down from the porch, shaking Nora's hand. "Thanks to you," he said. "Without your unit, Harlow would have burned more than wood that night." Nora's smile faded briefly. "He'll be in prison a long time. 25 years. No parole for the first 10. Justice came late, but it came." She glanced toward the valley. "You planning to stay here for good?" Ryan nodded. "Got my commission from the Forestry Service last week. They're pairing me with the Rangers to oversee the protected zones. Thought I'd trade combat boots for hiking ones." "Good choice," Nora said, her tone softening. "The forest could use men like you." Her gaze drifted to Elena, then back to Ryan, a knowing light in her eyes. "And people to keep them grounded." After Nora left, the valley fell quiet again, filled only with the hum of spring insects and the murmur of meltwater. Ryan walked toward Elena, who was now sitting on the wooden steps, watching Shadow chase drifting petals. He sat beside her, his hand brushing hers. "Feels strange," she said, "how the same valley that burned can bloom again." Ryan looked out at the ridges, the thin line of smoke from the rebuilt Ranger Tower curling into the blue sky. "Maybe that's what makes it beautiful," he replied. "It remembers, but keeps growing anyway." Elena turned toward him, a question in her eyes. "Do you ever miss it? The army, the missions, that life?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly I miss the idea of it. The purpose, the loyalty. Then I look here, at you, at him." He nodded toward Shadow, who was now lying in the grass, eyes half closed in peace. "And I realize purpose isn't found out there anymore. It's right here." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Ryan reached into his coat pocket, his heart pounding with a nervousness unfamiliar even after years of facing death. He turned toward Elena. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." She looked up, brows arched in curiosity. He took a slow breath and knelt on one knee, the motion careful, reverent. In his hand gleamed a small silver ring, simple, slightly tarnished, the metal worn smooth by time. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "I kept it with me through every mission, every storm. But I think she meant for it to find a home." For a long heartbeat, Elena said nothing. Her eyes filled with tears that shimmered like dew. The spring air seemed to still around them. The only sound, the rustle of pine needles and Shadow's soft whine, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Ryan," she whispered, voice trembling, "you don't even have to ask." He smiled, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit imperfectly but beautifully, like something that had waited years to find its place. She leaned forward, and when their foreheads touched, the world seemed to exhale around them. A week later, under a sky brushed with gold, their wedding took place beside the river that wound through the valley. It was small, quiet, attended only by a few townsfolk and a ranger priest named Father Alcott, an older man with a gentle stoop and kind gray eyes. His weathered face spoke of decades spent guiding lost souls in both church and wilderness. Dressed in a faded clerical coat and a smile that reached his eyes, he stood before them beneath a wooden arch decorated with pine branches and white lilies. "Love," he said softly, "is the only fire that leaves no ashes." Elena's dress was simple, ivory lace that brushed her ankles, her hair crowned with small bluebells she had grown herself. Ryan wore his ranger's uniform, freshly pressed, though the old service patch from his army days still clung to one sleeve. Shadow, wearing a clean leather collar, led them down the narrow wooden bridge toward the clearing, his gait proud despite the faint limp that remained. The guests laughed softly when he barked once, as though giving his blessing. When Father Alcott pronounced them husband and wife, the valley erupted in applause carried by the wind. Ryan kissed Elena gently, his hands cradling her face. Around them, snowmelt shimmered like glass under the afternoon sun. Shadow sat between them, his tail sweeping slowly across the wooden planks, his eyes bright as if he understood that the battle was finally over. Later, as twilight fell, the three of them walked along the riverbank, the soldier, the woman, and the dog who had bound their fates together. The air was alive with the sound of water and new life, and above them, the peaks of Aspen Ridge glowed faintly in the sunset. The valley had burned, and yet here they stood, proof that even from ashes something living could rise. In the quiet after the vows, as the sun lowered behind Aspen Ridge, the world seemed to breathe with them, a soft exhale of peace after years of storms. The cabin, the wildflowers, the river, all stood as proof that even after fire and loss, something beautiful can rise again. For some call it fate, but Elena believed it was God's hand, gentle, patient, guiding two wounded souls toward healing. Ryan had seen too much of war to believe in luck, yet in her eyes he saw the kind of miracle soldiers pray for in silence. Not thunder or glory, but the miracle of still being alive to love and be loved. And maybe that's the truest miracle of all, not the ones written in light or carved into stone, but the quiet ones God hides in our everyday lives. A loyal dog that saves a man, a stranger who opens her door in a storm, a love that blooms from ashes. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to remember your own small miracles, the people, the moments, the mercies you didn't expect but still received. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Comment below where you're watching from. Let this story travel further than the snow of Aspen Ridge. Subscribe for more tales of faith, loyalty, and redemption. And as you close your eyes tonight, may the same God who watched over Ryan, Elena, and Shadow watch over you too, guarding your home, your heart, and every step you take.